everyone, and welcome once again to one of our Hobby Memorial Library events and all of our friends in the back row. We are here today with a very special guest, Jason Deckman. He did a project called War Story Wednesdays, and it's an amazing project, and I'm going to let you tell us all about it. So thank you so much, sir, for being here.
Thank you for having me. So, thank you. Thank you. So she said, my name is Jason Deckman. I was in the United States Army for 23 years. I currently work for the city of Temple. And I'm glad to be here to talk about the photography project that I did in 2020 called War Story Wednesdays. Let me dive right in. So we'll start with a little about me. I was in the Army for 23 and a half years, half active and half reserve. About halfway through, made the decision that I was going to go into the reserves, and it was the right decision. My wife is still with me, because a lot of military marriages do not end well. Ours is going strong, so it was a good decision that I made. Joining the Army was the best thing I ever did. Taking me to places that I would never have seen, met people that I would never have met, learned things about how the world works that I would not have learned if I hadn't gotten out of my comfort zone and gotten out into the world. Some of them good, some of them bad, but just amazing experiences made me who I am. Now, looking at that picture and looking at me, you see why I prefer to be behind the camera and not looking at the camera, so I'm a photographer. So let me tell you about my photography project. And I'm not here to talk about myself as much as I am the veterans who were part of this project. So I'll start with the inspiration. This is not my original idea. There's other photographers who have done similar projects, which is take photos of people telling a story about themselves, capture the emotion, capture their facial expressions as they're telling the story about something that's near and dear to them. So I completely took that idea and ran with it in terms of let's hear some veterans tell their stories. And we came up with the idea of called War Story Wednesdays. But a lot of the inspiration and the motivation for me comes from my grandfather, who served in World War II as a Seabee. And we did not hear his stories of World War II growing up. The veterans of that generation didn't talk about it. It wasn't until years later when my cousin joined the Marines, and another cousin was in the Air Force, and I joined the Army, and we'd come home on leave, and little bits and pieces would trickle out. Whether it took him that long to be ready to tell the stories, or he felt that we were at a place that we could understand and grasp them without him having to spell it out, I don't know. We were lucky that we got to hear the stories we did from Granddad before he passed, but he died in 2015 with a lot of those stories untold. So that's part of the inspiration for this project, was to let's get some of these folks to come out and tell their stories so they're recorded before it's too late. So then the next thing I had to do was go find people and convince them to tell their stories. And different folks from different eras may or may not be comfortable. So I had to learn some salesmanship techniques, do some cold calling, or ask friends, help me to find the people that are willing to tell the stories. So that was a challenge through the project where we're collecting the stories, finding ways to promote it, finding ways to network. We eventually got 11 stories, printed and framed them on Veterans Day, so 11 was a significant number and ended up being the right number. But when I had started the project and talked with a few other folks, I wanted to have more. So we got just enough, but part of the reason was that promotion and getting people to come out of their shell to tell those stories was a challenge. Now, something that I had some measure of knowledge on going into the project is the photography. So I know how to take a picture. But taking a picture and telling a story with a picture are two very different things. How you light it, how you pose it, being able to connect with the subject, capture the emotion, and still feel like I'm listening to the story at the same time. Maybe I'm adjusting the flash, or I'm changing my position, and I'm moving up or down to get the right angle to capture that person's expression as they tell the story, or to be ready as their facial expression changes, their hand, comes out. Can I capture that moment? So this was a learning experience for me, just on a photographic level, of becoming a very good portrait photographer, learning how to connect with the subject. If you are a photographer and you are wanting to take photos, the technical aspect is the easy part. Connecting with the subject, that's where the art comes in. And I think I'll brag on myself. And some of these photos end up being very artistic and told a story. They conveyed an emotion. Now, what it wasn't a video project. I used a little video recorder and to capture the audio so I could transcribe the story in this person's words without all the filler words, without the and so, and then I said, and let's get the story in their words without that barrier of those filler words and the stuttering and the pauses. So it was a phrase I had heard before, but didn't really grasp it until I had to transcribe and get these words on paper. They say edited for clarity. That's exactly what it was. It was taking out those filler words, where the gaps, where they started telling the story, and they said, oh, but before I did that, this happened. And they realized they had to tell you about that prequel bit, so when they got to the end of the story, it made sense. So it was able to maybe take a slice here and put it into a paragraph in a sequence that made sense, and it was still this person's words. So it was important to me to be able to have this be a concise, clear-flowing, reads like you're listening to the person talk, but maybe took some artistic leeway with the actual sequence of how they said it. So really kept true to the spirit of what they were saying. And then the last challenge was framing and hanging the print. So asked a lot of folks for help with money to buy the frames. Had to order the frames online, got the glass locally because you can't ship bulk amounts of 16 by 20 inch glass because they won't do it in a break. So there were some logistics that I had to work through. And I've brought one of the stories that I'll talk about today, so if you are here in person, you want to go take a look at the frames. How can I get the printed story framed, the photo of the veteran framed, and then we took them to Firebase Brewing, which is where the exhibit took place on Veterans Day. We mounted everything the day before. We used Velcro tabs and found that his walls weren't exactly as smooth or as straight and true. And we had a couple pictures we thought the Velcro was going to hold. We're standing there admiring our handiwork, and then one of the pictures falls off. Glass cracks, dents the run back home for it, extra glass, extra frame. Last minute hiccups. If you've been in the military, you know that there's always a last minute hiccup, and all you do is react, get it done, and be ready. So the fact that we had gone the day before to get everything hung up gave us the time to react to that little mishap. So if you're undertaking a photographic exhibit and you're printing and framing, allow yourself time for mishaps. This is a lesson that I will share. So let's talk about the photographs, because that's the photographs and the stories. That's why we're here. That was why I did this. So let's talk about a few of the folks that were part of the project. Sid Blevins, local gentleman, U.S. Army veteran, and he's a musician, as you can see here. And that's how I knew him. I had taken photos of him playing live in concert. And we'd met during breaks. We'd hung out and become friends to a little bit. So I kind of had a sense of, okay, who's Sid? How does he interact with people? And part of the project was to capture photos of them telling the stories, but then have a nice posed photo that would be framed. That was what was going to go in the exhibit. And that would be given to the family, so they'd have a keepsake. And ultimately, the photo I chose of Sid for his frame photo was the one in the center of him playing guitar. The photo on the left, if you know Sid, And you look at his body language, he's not really comfortable. But when he had that guitar, he would play, and he would tell the story, and he'd play a little bit more, and he'd tell another story, or he would explain how he joined the Army, where he came from. And he had that guitar the whole time. So the way he expresses himself is much through words as through music. So the photo that was chosen to represent Sid was him playing. If you look at it as a portrait, you're supposed to be looking at the camera. You're not supposed to be looking at your left hand in the string. But for Sid, it made perfect sense. That's who he is. Oops. Okay. So Dorothy Plantis, lady lives in Temple, she's an Air Force veteran. We had ran a story in the Temple Telegram talking about we were starting the project and we were looking for volunteers. And she reached out and said, I don't know if you want to hear my story, but I'm willing to support the project. I'm willing to talk. We met her in her home. She had a friend sit in with us. She's like, okay, I don't know you. Do you mind if I have some? Of course. And then got there, got set up, and I said, okay, go. She wasn't sure where to start. So that was where I had to put some interview techniques in place. And start, well, tell me about something that made you laugh. Tell me about something that you struggled with, or where you got thrown in a situation that you were unprepared for. And then that enabled her to come out of her shell a little bit and tell some of her stories. Very interesting person, very interesting story. She served as a secure telecom operator. So she was on duty in the Pentagon the day Reagan got shot. She was there when the hostage crisis in Iran took place. And from what I know of being an operations center and having to respond during crisis, you have to be on it. You have to be confident in your skills. You have to know your equipment. And if you have the Pentagon, you've got the Joint Chiefs. You've got generals and people at how many stars on their collars and how many levels above your personal pay grade are counting on you. That's a high-pressure situation. She says, I've never went to combat. I don't know if I have a war story. Yeah, but you've done some stuff. And I mean, after having listened to her, earned my respect. But we did get some great photos. She pulled out her shadow box in terms of awards. Joint Chiefs Commendation. There's a lot of folks in the military that place great stock in. I have this ribbon, I served in this time, I went to this school and got this badge. There's a lot of folks that would fall all over themselves to get a Joint Chief of Staff commendation in their records, and she's got one. So, I mean, my hat's off to her. And when we get to the exhibit, she wasn't sure if she wanted to come to the exhibit, and she ended up coming out. And there's a great picture of her. So it really closed the loop for her to see the smile on her face and people pointing and then laughing that she said she wanted to, but when I got there, it was almost like she was having second thoughts. She wasn't sure that she was going to do this after all, but she did come out to the exhibit, and it was just a sweet moment. So when we get to the end, there's a photo of that, but I wanted to mention it before I forget. Oh, hang on. And one other thing, today being International Women's Day, one of the things she spoke about was being an Air Force veteran. She joined back in the 70s, and she went in a field that didn't have a lot of women. And she said, I recognized that a lot of folks had to fight battles. I was lucky I never had to fight that, but she recognized that other women did to be in the field that she was in. So I think that's also worthy of recognition. Now we'll skip forward. So Pat Patterson, he's a Vietnam veteran, lives in Temple. He was the first one to cry. And when I talked to a few folks when we started the project, we kind of asked ourselves, what are we going to do? How's that going to feel? And we didn't really know what we were getting into. When he got upset, and I knew him well enough at that point, I could tell by his body language he was getting to something that was really happy. And he kept fingers through his hands, and like he stopped making contact, and he was looking down more than he had been. And all of a sudden he stopped mid-sentence, mouth open. He wanted to say the words, he couldn't. And he was in the middle of the sentence talking about the 58,000 service members who died in Vietnam. And he got to say 58,000, and he stopped, full stop. And I stopped taking pictures, and I turned the little video recorder. I said, let's pause, go ahead, get yourself put back together. And then driving home that night, I had to pull over because it didn't really click with me in the moment. I'm at work, I'm taking photos, I'm in the moment, and then driving home, it hit me, and I had to pull over because I couldn't see it. I called my mom. I said, Mom, I made an old guy cry. And then I felt guilty about that. Now he was willingly chose to be there, but I asked him to be there. So I put him in that position of dredging up painful memories. And he said afterwards, once he was able to catch a breath and be able to speak again, he told me, I have not told anybody about that since I left Vietnam. So that was a memory and some pain and emotions that he had been carrying around for 40 going on 50 years. And it was a humbling realization to know that I gave him that opportunity. And this is how I wrapped my own head around what this project meant. I wasn't making old guys cry. I was giving them the opportunity to let something out that needed to get out. That they had an opportunity in a venue, a safe space, if you will, to feel that emotion, to express that emotion, to share that with someone who understood. And that informed the next one where it did get emotional. I did keep taking pictures because one of the conversations I had about I made an old guy cry. You started this project to tell the stories. Part of the story is the emotion. You need to document that. You need to hold yourself together because you got to be on the button to capture this. This is part of the story. So I was ready when I met Oops. Technology's having fun here. When I met Dr. Bert Colts, he's a retired dentist. He was a dentist in the Army, got drafted in Vietnam, served in the hospital, and had a chance to get away from the hospital to go out to special forces camps, interact with the locals, and talk about how he was able to practice dentistry in his military career. And he went on to become a dentist in his civilian career and retired. But one of the stories he told was a guy that they grew up about 50 miles apart from each other. They never knew each other until they met in Vietnam and were living in the same tent. And his friend was on a flight and was killed, and they recovered his body on Thanksgiving Day. And he said, I lost my body. And he got very choked up talking about how painful it was to lose him, as abrupt and as sudden as it was. And that's the nature of warfare. Doesn't mean it's not painful, but the pain that he carried, and this was another one that he said, I've never told everybody about this, is after his buddy died, he said, I wanted to, when I got home, to go talk to his widow or to go to meet his family. And he says, and I never did. I couldn't. I never could reach out and make that connection. And I mean, I think you see the photo that it's painful. There's some guilt there. Why did he survive and his buddy not? And he carried that. So if this project allowed him to maybe unburden himself, then that's a profound thing to have given him that chance. It's still not easy to make old people cry. But I think it's important. And he told some funny stories too. I think that was one of the takeaways from the project is they're not all painful stories, but maybe it's something that you wouldn't understand as a civilian he talked about they got to go to a leper colony. And the folks that would go to the leper colony and provide medical services to the lepers, they said that was the best part of being in Vietnam, because the VC would not touch the leper colony. So they knew while they were there, they were safe. He said, and the lepers were the most gracious people, grateful to have us there. He said, that was one of the best parts of Vietnam. And having done some operations in Kosovo myself, where we supported some medics, I was able to grasp that gratitude. But it's kind of a surreal, odd thing to say the best part of Vietnam was visiting a leper colony. So, lots of humor in the military. So Tom Brodigan, an Apache pilot, and he spoke very vividly, and he talked about how the first time he got to fly the Apache when he got out of flight school and they assigned him to that particular helicopter, he said it was like being in the controls of the Starship Enterprise. And he talked about his first kill in Iraq was a bird that hit the rotor and they had to sit down and get repairs. So lots of humor, some darkness as well. But as I went through the project, one of the things that I kept learning and applying was how I would light the subject. And by the time I got to Tom, I was really in love with the idea of lighting it from the side and getting that very, very dramatic side lighting. And so you see the photo, that was the one that we printed. Now it's a good photo, technically well lit, dramatic. But if you know Tom, it's not a good portrait of Tom. Because he's a very cheerful guy. He's friendly, he's easygoing, he's always telling. He's the nicest guy you'll ever meet. That photo makes him look mean. So it might not have been a great portrait of him. And this was another photographic lesson I learned of how you light the photo affects how the story is received. So that's also a good lesson in terms of the lighting and the storytelling. And he laughed about it. He busted my chops, as RV guys do. But it was a lesson that I did want to communicate. And then Chaplain Duckworth, he's also in Temple. He's active in the Rotary Club. And for those of you here, I've got his framed war story and his portrait over on the table. So you can see how I use the same frames, but turn the frame sideways to put the printed story in, and then in portrait orientation for the actual portrait. It saved money for me to be able to have the same frame throughout the project, but also have a uniform look. So the logistics came into play there. So if you'd like to read his full story, you can read it there. One of the things he talked about in the battle in Baghdad, where he had several KIAs and several wounded, and he was there as a chaplain ministering to the guys that were wounded and dealing with this battle. And it went on for hours. And he talked about just when we thought we had everybody situated, and then another truck or another Bradley would roll in with more casualties. And it just kept going and kept going. And at the end of the story, he talked about his respect for the soldiers who were so resilient to find ways to get their job done and make the best of it in bad circumstances. And I don't know if you realized it or not, but if you go back and read his story, that's exactly what he had done. He had had one soldier that he could see was in shock and needed to get somewhere. It was getting later in the evening. It was starting to get cold, as the desert does. And he realized this soldier needed some place to go sit and be warm. He found him a blanket and found a room in the building that they had set up for an aid station, thinking, okay, there's a nice quiet room, we can get him situated here, he can relax. And that was the room that had been turned into a makeshift morgue. And he didn't let that stop him from doing his job, which is to care for this soldier. So in the midst of horrible circumstance, he found ways to continue to be creative and dedicated. And again, my respect for him, but it was an observation to see that the thing that he respected the combat soldiers for, he lived and showed it himself. So I think it's worth noting, you've seen in some of the photos, Most of the stories we met at Firebase Brewing in Temple, and we met on Wednesdays because the brewery was closed on Wednesdays. So the owners are veterans. Asked, he said, yep, I would love to host it. I would love to just be a fly on the wall to listen to the stories. So most of the stories were at Firebase Brewery on Wednesdays, but there were a few that we did go to the person's house and said, I'm not comfortable, like Dorothy said, I'm not comfortable going to a brewery. Fair enough. Hey, I'm not available on Wednesday. Can we do it on Saturday? Of course. Because the story is more important than the tagline. But most of the stories were captured at Firebase, and that's where we held the exhibit. So that's the photo on the right of Dorothy and two of her friends. And even though this was during the pandemic, you can see the eyes. You smile with your eyes. You can see the joy that they're having, sharing that moment. To be able to create that during the day of the exhibit, to see the crowd of folks that came out, to see the veterans that came out with their families, and they'd all stand around, and mom and wife and nephews and sons, and all would be in a clump, and they'd be reading dad's story or the wife's story. And the word that I kept using was profound. I remember looking at my wife at one point, looking at these people, looking at these moments. They were making new memories, reading about the memories of the veterans of their service in war. And I looked at my wife and said, somebody else did this. It felt like I was standing back and watching it through someone else's eyes. It was surreal. It was profound. That's the only word that I can use that sums it up. It was profound. I was honored to honor them, but to have got through it and made it happen and seeing how well received it was blew me away. So the fact that I still get to come out and talk about it, I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful that if I can continue to talk about these folks, these men and women that told their stories, can we encourage other folks, even if it's not part of a photographic project or a video project or a YouTube, what have you, sit down with your loved ones and say, let me tell you about the time I was in Kosovo. Let me tell you about that day in Iraq. Let me tell you why I get nervous when you slam the door. It may be painful to share those experiences, but it is so important. So those of you that have been in the military, familiar with the term after action review, you always go back afterwards and say, did I do what I wanted to do? Did I do what I was supposed to do? What could I have done different? What could I have done better? So you've heard me talk a little bit about the image styles that maybe I wanted to have that creative, dramatic lighting because I'm a photographer. I'm going to light it, and I got this new flash, and I'm going to use it. I've since learned that there are times to light it that way. There are times to use the natural light. So that was a lesson that I took away. How you light the photo affects how you tell that story and affects how that person is perceived. The communication. It was just important for me to listen to them telling their story. And sometimes we would stop and I would share a story of my own, put the camera down, hey, I did a med cap in Kosovo. And we compared notes about the Kosovo kids getting flu shots and the lepers in Vietnam getting their teeth pulled or what have you. So, and that happened on several stories. It several times made me laugh and a couple times made me cry. But it was a function of them knowing that I understood, that I could relate, and that I wasn't just some guy with a camera snapping away, that I was just as affected by it as they were. So there was some great communication, and it wasn't always easy. But it was therapy. To let out those emotions that you've been carrying for 40 years. I have a story of my own that got told a few times about a guilt that I carry that I'll never be able to discharge it. But the more I talk about it, I can live with it. So there's a certain level of therapy that comes with telling stories. Not that you have to be a certified psychologist to hear the story, but you can relate and you can listen, and that's the most important thing. Just listen to the person that wants to tell that story. Give them the opportunity, the venue, to tell their story. And last, the salesmanship. We did the stories. We got 11 stories done in 2020. And folks said, you should keep doing this. I got 3 more done, and then it just kind of fizzled. One, I wasn't pursuing people as aggressively as maybe I could have. The buzz surrounding the project kind of went away, and I stopped having people reach out to me and go, hey, are you still, we just haven't done any since 21. I'm open to doing more horror stories. If someone wants to reach out, love to tell that story. Love to meet and take those pictures and capture that emotion. I just haven't done any, and it's mostly down to my lack of salesmanship. My dad was a salesman. He was the proverbial guy that could sell a ketchup popsicle to a woman wearing white mittens, and I did not inherit that skill from the old man. So that concludes the presentation. Thank y'all for coming. And if there's any questions, either in person or I don't know if you can do questions online, I'm happy to answer any questions.
I do have a question. In our own pursuit of listening to people's military stories, as you said with one of the people that you spoke with, they would start talking and then they would stop, and it was almost like, I'm not supposed to say more. Did you find that a lot? And it was for certain campaigns, like Vietnam more than the other campaigns, where they would just stop. And I'm just not going to say anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think part of it, because we did it in a private area, the brewery, the ones that were on Wednesdays at the brewery, it was the veteran, me, and JD. JD McBride's the owner. So it was 3 of us. And we explained, both of us have seen combat. If you want to drop F-bombs and swear up and down like a sailor, we've heard it all. Speak freely. Warning for those that read some of the stories, yes, there's some swear words in there. But they had the freedom to say what needed to be said without worrying that, well, my wife's going to hear me talk about this. Okay, maybe she can read it later, but that separation, I think, gave them the freedom to talk about it. But there was a couple times where you could tell they were reluctant to go into any more detail than they felt was necessary. And to be honest, I really didn't push them. I didn't approach it as an interview. I just approached it as, here's your opportunity to tell your story. And the only time I would come in and interject was when I'd see them like run out of steam or maybe lose their train of thought. And then I would just try to ask kind of a pointed or open-ended question. Hey, you mentioned the helicopter flying low to the ground, so who was in the, oh, well then that. Or if they would use jargon. So I was flying an OV-10. What's an OV-10? Oh, well that's a whole interesting other story, which ended up being some opportunities. But for the most part, I just shut up, took pictures with the camera, and just let them talk.
But they knew it was a safe, no judgment zone.
Exactly. Yep.
Awesome. Did you find in looking back, I'm sorry, I have another
Yes,
question.
go ahead.
Did you find, looking back at some of the images, that you may have seen something in the image that you missed when you were talking to them, like,
Oh, yeah.
like pain or something?
Some of them, there was maybe a good expression or a good hand gesture, but for whatever reason, maybe the focus was off, or I was just a little bit late on the shutter. So there was some images that I would have liked to have used, but I didn't, just from a technical aspect. I may have not included it in this presentation. There was a couple where, like Pat, it was fine with his shirt, but there was a couple where the guys, he said, dress how you want. You don't have to be in uniform. Be And after I took the picture, got home, and, the collar was a little bit wonky. I wish I had captured and realized and fixed that before I captured the image. There was another one. It wasn't a photographic thing. The guy showed up just wearing a t-shirt. Younger guy, reasonably good shape, so okay, he's going to wear a t-shirt. And his girlfriend at the time, now his wife, and I sent her the picture. She goes, "You wore a t-shirt?" Really? Hey, that's not, don't yell at me. I think, does that kind of answer your question?
It does. Thank you
All right.
so much.
Thank you.
And let me just.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the last slide. If
It
you,
must have been an amazing opportunity then, and thank you for doing that.
I've met a lot of people who are now good friends because of the project. So if you want to read the full stories, they're on my Patreon. They're set for public access. If you go to my Facebook, I put a link to it, so it's filtered by the hashtag. If you or someone you know wants to tell their story, my contact info is there. You can find me on most social media under Deckman's World. Like I said, I'm not a great salesman, but I'll take this opportunity to be one. So would love to capture more stories.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Sounds good. And I just wanted to remind everyone, we have more military history stories. They're pre-recorded that we're going to be showing next month. And we have other events that are coming up, mostly virtual. Not next week, but the following week, we have another night sky tour with Warren Hart. We have an astronomer. So thank you all so much, and thank you, sir. We truly appreciate you taking the time to come during the day to talk to us. And our students globally are also touched by your story and